In the quiet conservation laboratory of the National Museum of African American History, the temperature stayed at exactly 68 degrees and the humidity at 45%. Dr. Angela Morrison adjusted her magnifying lamp over an old metal photograph that had arrived 3 weeks earlier from an estate sale in Charleston. The plate was no larger than a book and showed the soft silver look of pictures from the middle of the 1800s. Years of air and time had made the surface dull and grey, but Angela had cleaned and saved hundreds of Civil War photographs before. Still, this one held her attention from the first moment she saw it. The picture showed a formal family group standing on the wide porch of a big plantation house. A colonel stood tall in his military uniform. His wife sat in a large fancy dress. 4 children stood in a neat line by height. Everything looked careful and proud. But in the background, near a white column, stood a small figure almost lost in the shadows. A child, maybe 9 years old. She wore a plain dress and her face was hard to see through the damage on the plate. Her arms were held tightly behind her back in a stiff and unnatural way. Angela's colleague Marcus Chen walked over with 2 cups of coffee. Still working on the Charleston picture, he asked. "There is something here," Angela answered without looking up. "This child does not fit the way she is placed." Marcus leaned in and looked through the glass. "Probably an enslaved child," he said. "Families often put their servants in pictures to show their wealth." The word made Angela's jaw tighten, even though she had seen this hard truth many times. "Look at her hands," she said, pointing with a soft tool. "They are behind her back, but she is not just resting them. She is holding something." Marcus thought it might be damage or a shadow from the long camera time. Angela shook her head. "I have done this work for 15 years. This looks planned." She wrote a note in her log. "Tomorrow I will begin the full cleaning and chemical work." That night Angela could not sleep. She lay in her apartment in Washington, thinking about the little girl in the shadows. What had her life been like? What had she seen and suffered? What was she hiding? Before sunrise, Angela was back at the lab. She prepared her tools with great care: chemicals, cotton swabs, and a camera to record every step. First, she gently brushed away dust with soft brushes. Slowly, the family on the porch grew clearer. The colonel's buttons shone. The wife's jewelry caught the light. The children's faces became sharp, but the girl in the back stayed hidden behind tarnish and shadow. By mid-morning, Marcus returned with food, knowing Angela often forgot to eat. "The family looks good," Angela said, "but the girl has heavy damage." Marcus suggested stronger chemical cleaning. Angela agreed, and began using a weak solution a little at a time. While working, she noticed something near the girl's feet. The floorboards looked blurred. The family had stood perfectly still for the long camera exposure, but the child had moved. Why would she move when everyone knew movement would ruin the picture? Angela looked at Marcus. Because whatever she held behind her back mattered more to her than standing still, more than any punishment she might receive. Day after day, Angela worked with great patience. She cleaned tiny areas, rinsed them, and took pictures. On the 3rd day, the girl's face began to appear. Angela's breath caught. The child had a small nose, full lips, and eyes that looked straight into the camera. The look was not fear or sadness. It was strong and decided. Marcus came when Angela called. The girl stared out from the year 1860 with eyes that seemed far older than 9. "She knew the camera was there," Marcus said quietly. "She is looking at us," Angela answered. She wanted every person who would ever see this picture to see her and to see what she held. Cleaning the hands took longer. The damage was worse there, and the area had been left darker on purpose. The photographer had placed the child in the deepest shadow so she would barely show in the family picture. Angela kept working. On the 5th day, she saw a sharp metallic shape behind the girl's right hip. She stopped and photographed it carefully. Layer by layer, more of the object appeared. It was small, about 4 inches long and narrow. The child's fingers wrapped tightly around it. By late afternoon, Angela could no longer doubt what she saw. She called Marcus at once. This child was holding a weapon. When Marcus returned, the knife was clear in the restored image. A small blade gripped with purpose, while the girl stood only a few feet from the family that owned her. The meaning hit them both hard. During a proud family photograph, this 9-year-old stood in the background, armed and staring straight at the camera. Angela said, "We must find out who she was and what happened after this picture was taken." The next morning, she contacted Dr. Raymond Foster, a historian in Charleston who knew the old plantations well. She sent him clear copies of the restored photograph. He called back within 2 hours. "I think I know this house," he said. "The columns and the porch design match a plantation on the Ashley River, and if I am right, something big happened there in the summer of 1860. 3 days after the date on this photograph, 23 enslaved people tried to escape together. It was one of the largest group escapes in the county that year. Most were caught and punished hard, but 7 got away and were never found. Among them was a girl listed only as Sarah, age 9. Angela felt a chill. "I think we have found Sarah," she said. Raymond came to the museum 2 days later with a thick folder of old papers. The plantation belonged to a colonel who made money from cotton and rice and held more than 200 people in slavery. In the plantation record book for June 1860, they found the entry "Sarah, age 9, bought in 1858, value $400 house servant." A letter the colonel wrote to his brother 5 days after the photograph complained about the escape. He called it betrayal and mentioned the 9-year-old housegirl who had been thought trustworthy. The dates lined up perfectly. The picture was taken on June 10th. The escape happened on the night of June 12th. Sarah had stood behind the family with a knife in her hands only 2 days before she helped lead people to freedom. This was not a sudden act. It was planned. Angela and Raymond began a wide search. They looked through records of the Underground Railroad and papers from cities in the north, where free black people and white helpers had sheltered runaways. While examining the girl's dress under strong magnification, Angela found tiny stitched marks along the hem, a star, a gourd shape, 2 lines and a cross. These were secret signs used on the Underground Railroad, the North Star, and the drinking gourd that pointed the way to freedom. Raymond's voice grew excited when he saw them. Sarah was not only escaping, she was guiding others. A 9-year-old house servant who could overhear plans and maps had become a conductor on the secret path north. Soon they found letters from Philadelphia. In early July 1860, a group of 7 people from South Carolina arrived, guided by a child of 9 years with remarkable courage. The child had suffered fever but recovered. Later records showed a girl named Sarah placed with a Quaker family, the Webbs, for education and safety. School papers listed Sarah Webb as a bright and determined student. A letter from Elizabeth Webb to her sister spoke of the girl's nightmares and how she still clutched the small knife she had carried from Charleston. Elizabeth could not bring herself to take it away. The knife meant the right to protect herself, the refusal to ever be powerless again. Sarah grew up in that safe home. By 1870, the census showed her living in Philadelphia, age 19, working as a teacher. She taught children who had also been born in slavery. Newspaper articles described her speaking at meetings about her journey from bondage to freedom and the power of education. She married James Parker, a man who had served in the United States colored troops. They had 3 children and made sure every one of them received a good education. Sarah continued speaking, writing, and helping newly freed people for the rest of her life. She never forgot the child she had been or the knife she had carried. An old letter Sarah wrote to Elizabeth Webb after Thomas Webb died showed her heart clearly. "You took me in when I was a frightened child with a knife and bad dreams," she wrote. "You never asked me to pretend the scars were gone. You taught me that freedom means the right to become whoever I choose. I still carry that knife, not because I plan to use it, but because I refuse to forget who I had to be to survive. That child made me who I am, and I honor her every day." Sarah lived into the early 1900s. Her short obituary in a Philadelphia paper called her an educator and advocate who had dedicated her life to the advancement of her people. She was survived by her husband, 3 children, and many grandchildren. The search for living family took weeks of careful work through old marriage, birth, and census records. At last they found Dr. Michelle Parker, a professor at Howard University, Sarah's great-great-granddaughter. When Raymond called and explained the discovery, Michelle came to the laboratory with her teenage daughter. She stood in front of the restored photograph and wept. "My grandmother always told stories of a child who escaped slavery," she said, "but we never had a name or a face. Now we do." 6 months later, the museum opened a special exhibition timed for Juneteenth. The restored photograph hung large on the central wall with Sarah's face and the hidden knife clear for every visitor to see. Beside it lay the plantation ledger, the escape letters, the school records, the newspaper articles, and Sarah's own words. The exhibition was called "What She Carried: Sarah's Story of Resistance and Freedom." On opening day, Michelle Parker stood with her family and told reporters, "My great-great-grandmother stood behind the people who enslaved her with a weapon in her hands. She stared into that camera and refused to be invisible." At 9 years old, she guided 6 adults to freedom. Then she spent the rest of her life fighting so others could be free too. That is the strength we come from. Angela watched visitors of all ages stop in front of the picture. Children listened as parents explained the knife and why it mattered. Older people wiped their eyes. Young people took quiet photos claiming connection to the story. Late that evening, Marcus found Angela still in the gallery. "You brought her back," he said. Angela looked at the photograph one more time. "I only cleaned away the damage," she answered. "Sarah brought herself back. 164 years ago, she stared into that camera and made sure we would see her. She refused to be erased. All I did was honor that refusal." The damaged metal plate from a Charleston estate sale had become a clear window into one remarkable life. A life that mattered, that changed others, and that refused to be forgotten. Sarah had stood in the shadows of that porch with a blade behind her back and fire in her heart. Now the world finally knew her name and would not forget.